My name is Aria Dixon, and I am 32 years old. Last month, I woke up in my Atlanta apartment to 34 missed calls. The first call was from my mother. The last one was from my sister, Brooke. It had been exactly 8 years, 2 months, and 4 days since any of them had spoken my name. They did not call to ask how I was doing. They did not call to apologize for the decade they spent telling everyone in our Georgia hometown that I was unstable. I stood in my kitchen and listened to the voicemails one by one. I heard my mother panic. I heard my father offer hollow bargains. I heard my sister cry. Not one of them said they were sorry. Every single message ended with the exact same 3 words: sign the papers. They wanted a bailout. But here is what my family did not realize. I work as a director of logistics. I deal in supply chains, tracking missing freight down to the exact ounce. I locate anomalies. I bring order to chaos. For 8 years, while they erased me, I kept a heavy gray accordion folder locked in a fireproof cabinet in my office. Every passive-aggressive social media post my mother made, every lie they told our extended relatives, every original bank ledger I took the night I left, all of it was printed, dated, and filed. They brought 34 demands. I brought an 8-year audit. Before we get into how that played out, welcome to Revenge Order. If you know what it feels like to rebuild yourself from the ground up, take a second to like and subscribe. And tell me in the comments how old you are and where you are listening from tonight. I read every single one. Let me take you back to the day the silence started. Savannah, Georgia. My family owned a mid-sized landscaping supply company. The warehouse always smelled like damp cardboard and nitrogen fertilizer. My father, Thomas, handled the contractors. My mother, Helen, handled the public image. My sister, Brooke, handled the credit cards. Brooke was the center of their gravity. She had the right smile, the right friends, and an upcoming wedding to a man named Tyler that required a luxury venue and custom floral arrangements. I was the bookkeeper. I sat in a windowless office near the loading dock, balancing the accounts, making sure the vendors got paid. 2 weeks before Brooke walked down the aisle, I opened the main operating account. A line item glared back at me. $40,000 had been withdrawn from the company emergency fund. No invoice, no vendor name, just a direct wire transfer. I printed the statement. I walked into my father's office. My mother was sitting in the leather guest chair, holding a cup of tea. I placed the paper on the desk. Someone transferred $40,000 out of the reserve, I said. My father did not look at the paper. He looked at my mother. Helen set her teacup down. The porcelain clicked sharply against the coaster. She did not look surprised. She looked inconvenienced. We know about the money, Aria, she said. Her voice was too calm, too practiced. We just did not think you would be careless enough to leave a paper trail. I stopped breathing. The air in the room felt thick. What are you talking about? My father finally looked at me. His eyes darted away a second later. Your sister needs this wedding to go smoothly. Tyler's family expects a certain standard. We are not going to let your theft ruin her day. I stared at them. Brooke took the money. She drained the emergency fund for the wedding, and they knew. They knew, and they were looking right at me, handing me the blame like a coat they expected me to wear. I did not take a single dollar, I said. You can trace the wire. It went to her. My mother stood up. She smoothed the front of her skirt. The truth is what we decide it is, and we have decided not to press charges. We are going to tell the church that we begged the police for leniency, that we are showing you grace. People will admire that. She looked at me the way you look at a broken piece of machinery. If you try to show those ledgers to anyone, we will say you forged them to cover your tracks. Who do you think Savannah is going to believe? She was right. Savannah would believe the woman who organized the charity drives, not the quiet girl who sat by the loading dock. I did not scream. I did not cry. I walked back to my windowless office. I opened the bottom drawer and took the original master ledgers. I put them in a canvas backpack along with my winter coat and the $200 I had saved from overtime. I walked out the back door of the warehouse. I did not say goodbye. I walked 2 miles to the Greyhound station and bought a one-way ticket to Atlanta. I left them with their pristine image, their luxury wedding, and a financial hole they would eventually have to answer for. I just did not expect it to take 8 years. The Greyhound bus smelled of stale upholstery and diesel fumes. I sat in the window seat near the back, watching the pine trees of Savannah blur into the dark. The vibration of the engine rattled against my spine. I did not sleep during the 4-hour ride to Atlanta. I kept my hand inside my coat pocket, my fingers curled around the 2 crumpled $100 bills. That was the exact price of my freedom, $200 and the clothes on my back. When the bus pulled into the downtown Atlanta terminal, the sky was a bruised purple. The air here felt different, thicker, louder. I walked out of the station and blended into the current of early morning commuters. Nobody knew my name. Nobody cared where I came from. For the first time in my life, I was entirely anonymous. I found a weekly motel on the edge of the city. The room had cinder block walls, painted a pale institutional green, and a window that looked out over a chain-link fence. I paid for 1 week in cash. I sat on the edge of the mattress, placed my canvas backpack on the floor, and pulled out the copies of the landscaping company ledgers. I smoothed the creases flat. I traced the ink on the paper, the wire transfer dates, the vendor routing numbers, the exact $40,000 that paid for a luxury venue, imported orchids, and a custom silk gown. Brooke was getting married that same afternoon. While I sat in a cinder block room listening to the hum of a broken ice machine down the hall, my sister was walking down an aisle covered in white petals. I opened my phone. I had 32 unread text messages. None of them were from my parents asking if I was safe. They were from cousins, family friends, and members of the Savannah First Baptist Church. The first message was from Aunt Clara. It read, "How could you do this to your mother on Brooke's special day? You need serious psychiatric help." The second was from a girl I had known since middle school. She wrote, "Stealing from your own family is sick. Do not ever contact me again." I did not reply. I opened the social media application. I navigated to my mother's public profile. Helen Dixon had not let my departure go to waste. She had weaponized it. There was a photo of my mother standing in the church foyer, wearing her tailored navy suit, dabbing her eyes with a lace handkerchief. The caption was a masterclass in public relations. It read, "Today is a day of immense joy as we celebrate Brooke, but it is also a day of heavy sorrow. Our hearts are broken by Aria's choices. The financial theft is devastating, but the betrayal of trust is worse. Thomas and I have chosen grace. We will not press criminal charges. We only ask for your prayers for our troubled daughter." I read the paragraph 3 times. I looked at the comments. Over 100 people praising Helen for her strength, her mercy, and her unwavering Christian charity. They called her a saint. They called me a monster. My mother had orchestrated a perfect execution. She knew that if she simply accused me, there might be an investigation. Questions might be asked. Bank records might be pulled. But by publicly forgiving me for a crime I did not commit, she bypassed the legal system entirely. She convicted me in the court of public opinion, where no evidence was required. Her mercy was the nail in my coffin. She shielded Brooke's theft, protected the family business reputation, and elevated her own social status in a single move. I realized something profound sitting on that cheap motel bed. I was not a daughter to them. I was currency. My reputation was the exact price they were willing to pay to maintain their flawless image. My hands stopped shaking. The tight, suffocating panic in my chest dissolved into something cold and hard. Anger is a messy emotion. It makes you reckless. It makes you scream and break things. I did not want to be angry. I wanted to be precise. I walked out of the motel and walked 3 blocks to a discount office supply store. I spent 5 of my remaining dollars on a heavy gray accordion folder. I carried it back to my room. I placed the original copies of the bank ledgers into the first slot. Then I walked to the public library. I paid 10 cents a page to print out my mother's social media post. I printed Aunt Clara's text messages. I printed the public wedding registry showing the luxury vendors Brooke had hired. I wrote the date on the top corner of every single page in black ink. I slid the stack of paper into the gray folder. I closed the elastic band around the plastic button. The archive had begun. The next morning, I started rebuilding. I did not have a safety net. I did not have a safety contact. If I got sick, there was no one to call. If I could not make rent, there was no childhood bedroom to return to. I found a job working the overnight shift at a commercial freight warehouse. It paid minimum wage. The work was grueling. I stood on a concrete floor for 10 hours a night, scanning barcodes, logging inventory, tracing the movement of pallets across the country. I learned the rhythm of supply chains. I learned that every missing item leaves a footprint if you know how to read the documentation. I lived on cheap pasta and instant coffee. I bought my clothes from clearance racks. I worked the night shift and took online business classes during the day. I slept 4 hours a night. There was no glamorous montage. There was just relentless, quiet survival. Whenever a holiday passed, I checked the public profiles. Helen posted photos of Thanksgiving dinners, Christmas mornings, and Easter brunches. Brooke and Tyler always stood in the center, smiling, holding crystal wine glasses. My father always stood slightly behind them, looking at the camera with the black expression of a man who had traded his spine for peace and quiet. I never appeared in the photos. I was the ghost they used to scare each other. The cautionary tale Helen whispered at church potlucks to garner sympathy. Every time a relative forwarded me a link or sent a self-righteous message demanding I repent, I went to the library. I printed the interaction. I dated the page. I added it to the gray folder. The folder grew thicker. The canvas edges began to fray. Over the years, the night shift turned into a daytime logistics coordinator position. The online classes turned into a degree. The degree turned into a corporate supply chain analyst role. I was good at my job because I understood how to look for the things people tried to hide. I tracked discrepancies. I held vendors accountable. I treated my career the same way I treated my past. I kept the receipts. I built a new life in Atlanta. I made friends who did not care about my last name. I met David, a sharp corporate attorney who played chess in the park on weekends and understood the value of a solid contract. He became the older brother I never had. My apartment upgraded from a cinder block motel room to a high-rise overlooking the city. My bank account grew from $200 to a number my mother could not comprehend. I did not do it for revenge. I did it because success is the most impenetrable armor you can build. For 8 years, the silence from Savannah was absolute. They had their narrative, and I had my piece. They believed the story they told the town. They believed they had won. But lies require maintenance. They require a steady stream of capital to sustain the illusion. Tyler, Brooke's husband, liked the appearance of wealth far more than the labor required to generate it. He bought expensive trucks. He took luxury vacations. He expanded his construction business on credit, assuming the economy would always float his ambitions. He was wrong. The market shifted. The interest rates climbed. The creditors started calling. I learned the details later, but the timeline was undeniable. Brooke watched her perfect life begin to fracture. The bank threatened foreclosure on their sprawling suburban home. The landscaping company my parents ran started missing vendor payments because they had funneled too much cash into Tyler's failing ventures. Panic set in. The golden child was losing her shine. In a moment of pure desperation, Brooke sat at her kitchen table and typed my name into a search engine. She had not looked me up in a decade. She expected to find a mugshot. She expected to find a tragic failure that would validate every lie they ever told. Instead, she found a feature article in a regional business magazine. The headline read, Aria Dixon named senior partner at premier Atlanta logistics firm. The article detailed my portfolio. It mentioned the multi-million-dollar accounts I managed. It highlighted my clean, upward trajectory. Brooke stared at the screen. The numbers had changed. The sister she sacrificed for a wedding dress was no longer an exiled failure. She was a resource. And in my family, resources were meant to be drained. That was the night the 34 voicemails began, the night the silence broke. The night Brooke decided she could walk back into my life and hand me an invoice. She thought she could just dial my number and demand a rescue. She was about to find out that I was no longer the girl sitting by the loading dock. I was the woman holding the gray folder, and I was ready to audit the account. The transition from the overnight shift to the corporate suite was not a cinematic montage. It was a systematic eradication of my own weakness. By my third year in Atlanta, I traded the concrete warehouse floor for a windowless cubicle at Vanguard Freight Solutions. I audited shipping routes. I calculated fuel burn rates. I found logistical inefficiencies that entire departments had overlooked for a decade. I did this because when you have no safety net, you have to become indispensable. If you are indispensable, you cannot be discarded. When I caught a routing anomaly that saved Vanguard $2 million in a single fiscal quarter, the board of directors noticed. I was promoted to regional manager. 2 years later, I became director of operations. By year 7, they offered me a seat at the table, senior partner. The firm was valued at $44 million. My name sat on the letterhead next to men who had Ivy League pedigrees. I had a degree from an online university and a work ethic forged in sheer survival. The only person who knew the truth about my departure from Savannah was David. David was Vanguard's chief corporate counsel. He was 45, wore sharp charcoal suits, and viewed the law not as a set of rules, but as a chessboard. We met during a brutal merger negotiation. I provided the numbers, he provided the legal framework. We stayed in the office until 2 a.m, eating cold noodles from cardboard cartons, tearing apart the opposing counsel's contract line by line. David looked at me across the conference table, pointed his chopsticks at my spreadsheet, and noted that I did not trust anyone. I told him trust is a liability. He smiled. He replied that trust is a contract. You just have to read the fine print. David became my sounding board, my mentor, my chosen family. He spent Thanksgiving at my apartment. We did not discuss my blood relatives. He knew they existed only as ghosts. But ghosts still cast shadows. Throughout my climb, my mother maintained her performance back in my hometown. I kept my social media profiles locked down, visible only to industry peers. Helen kept hers wide open. She crafted a digital narrative of a grieving, pious mother. On the 5-year anniversary of my departure, she posted a picture of a single lit candle on her dining room table. The caption read, "Still praying for the daughter who lost her way." A mother's heart never closes its door to a wandering child. I sat in my high-rise office, overlooking the Atlanta skyline, and looked at that post. I did not feel a sting of rejection. I felt the cold, analytical distance of an auditor reviewing a fraudulent tax return. I pressed print. The laser printer hummed. The page slid out, warm to the touch. I wrote the date in the top right corner with a red pen. I opened the bottom drawer of my cabinet, unhooked the elastic band of the gray accordion folder, and filed it away. The folder was thick now. It contained dozens of these fabricated grief performances. I kept them because memory is fragile, but ink on paper is permanent. While I was acquiring commercial shipping hubs, Tyler was acquiring debt. My sister's husband possessed the kind of arrogance that only flourishes in small ponds. He ran a construction firm that specialized in luxury renovations. For a few years, the illusion held. He bought a boat. Brooke drove a European sports utility vehicle. They hosted lavish catered parties at their home, projecting an image of untouchable success. But the foundation rested on high-interest credit and borrowed time. When the local real estate market cooled, Tyler's contracts dried up. The variable interest rates on his business loans adjusted upward. The math became inescapable. He owed vendors, he owed subcontractors, he owed the bank. To keep the creditors at bay, he quietly siphoned money from my parents' landscaping business. Helen and Thomas allowed it. They funneled their own company's operating capital into Tyler's sinking ship, because acknowledging his failure meant acknowledging that Brooke had married a fraud. They would rather bankrupt themselves than lose face in front of the Savannah Country Club. The collapse was inevitable. 6 weeks ago, the bank initiated foreclosure proceedings on Tyler and Brooke's suburban estate. Their credit cards were frozen. The landscaping company could no longer cover the deficit. Panic strips away pride and leaves only sheer survival instinct. Brooke sat at her kitchen table, staring at a stack of final notice envelopes. She had exhausted every local resource. Her friends had stopped returning her calls. Her parents were tapped out. She needed a miracle. She needed a new host to drain. She opened her laptop. She typed my name into the search bar. Brooke expected to find a forgotten obituary or a low-level administrative profile. Instead, the search engine returned a glossy digital feature from Forbes Atlanta, published 3 months prior. The headline read, "The Freight Architect." Below it was a high-resolution photograph. I stood in front of a commercial shipping yard, wearing a tailored navy blazer, my arms crossed, looking directly into the lens. The article detailed Vanguard's recent acquisitions. It listed the firm's impressive valuation. It praised my logistical strategy and estimated my personal equity in the company. Brooke read the numbers. She read them again. The sister she had discarded like trash was sitting on a mountain of corporate wealth. The girl they framed for $40,000 was now negotiating contracts worth 10 times that amount before lunch. The dynamic shifted in an instant. In Brooke's mind, my success did not belong to me. In the warped ecosystem of our family, I existed only to serve her needs. If I had money, it was their money. I was not an estranged human being who had survived their cruelty. I was a forgotten bank account that had just matured. She picked up her phone and called my mother. Helen called my father. The Dixon family mobilized. The narrative of the wandering, troubled daughter was instantly suspended. They did not need a scapegoat anymore. They needed a checkbook. That was the catalyst for the 34 voicemails. They dialed my number in a frenzy, believing that a barrage of panic demands would trigger my old childhood conditioning. They expected me to answer the phone, hear their distress, and immediately revert to the obedient, silent girl who fixed their problems. They said, "Sign the papers," because they had drawn up a commercial loan guarantee. They wanted me to co-sign a 6-figure debt to save Tyler's business, securing it against my own corporate equity. But the 34 voicemails went unanswered. I sat in my kitchen, drank my coffee, and locked the gray folder back in the fireproof cabinet. Brooke realized the phone calls were failing. The digital assault was bouncing off a wall she could not penetrate. When a parasite cannot reach the host remotely, it has to close the distance. Ignoring her calls did not make her stop. It forced her to escalate. Brooke grabbed her car keys. She left the foreclosure notices on her kitchen table, walked out to her vehicle, and started the engine. She mapped the route to the Vanguard Freight Solutions corporate headquarters. She was going to drive 3 hours to Atlanta. She was going to walk into my lobby, and she was going to demand her salvation in person. The lobby of Vanguard Freight Solutions was designed to intimidate. Expansive walls of reinforced glass overlooked the downtown connector. The floor was polished gray terrazzo, reflecting the cool, recessed lighting overhead. 2 security guards stood near the elevators, wearing dark suits, their posture rigid. This was my domain. It was a space governed by procedure, access badges, and scheduled appointments. It was a fortress. It was a Tuesday afternoon, just past 2 o'clock. I had stepped out of a quarterly projections meeting to grab a coffee from the lobby cafe. I held a stack of routing manifests in my left hand. I was calculating warehouse capacities in my head when the revolving glass doors spun open. Brooke walked through them. The physical shock of seeing her felt like stepping into an elevator that suddenly drops 2 floors. I had not laid eyes on her in 8 years. The reality of her appearance did not match the pristine images Helen posted online. Brooke looked frayed. Her blonde hair, usually styled into soft waves, was pulled into a harsh knot. She wore an expensive trench coat, but the fabric was wrinkled, and the dark circles under her eyes cut through the thick layer of foundation she had applied. She carried a manila envelope gripped tightly in her right hand. She spotted me near the cafe counter. She did not hesitate. She crossed the terrazzo floor, the heels of her boots echoing sharply in the cavernous space. Aria. She said my name loudly. Too loudly for a corporate environment. Several executives standing near the elevators paused their conversations and turned their heads. This was Brooke's classic tactical maneuver. She weaponized public spaces. In Savannah, if she wanted something from our parents, she would pick a fight in a restaurant or the church parking lot. She understood that most people would surrender anything to avoid a public scene. She was banking on my fear of professional embarrassment. I did not flinch. I did not step backward. I stood perfectly still, holding my coffee, and waited for her to close the distance. She stopped 3 feet away. Her chest heaved, a deliberate, theatrical performance of distress. She reached out, attempting to grab my forearm. I shifted my weight, slipping my arm out of her reach. Do not touch me. Her hand dropped. The tears started instantly. It was a remarkable physiological trick she had mastered as a teenager. The water welled in her eyes and spilled over her lashes on command. Aria, please. She let her voice crack, projecting the sound so the security desk could hear. You have to listen to me. We are losing everything. The house, Tyler's business. The bank is going to take it all. You are the only one who can fix this. I looked at the woman standing in front of me. She had orchestrated my exile. She had drained the company funds, worn a designer gown paid for with stolen money, and watched me walk to a bus station with nothing. Now, she was standing in my lobby, acting as though the last decade had been a brief, unfortunate misunderstanding. How did you get past the reception desk, Brooke? She ignored the question. She shoved the manila envelope toward my chest. I need you to sign this. It is a commercial loan guarantee, $150,000. It is nothing to you. I read the article. I know what you make. You can collateralize it against your equity in this company. If you just sign this, the bank will release the funds tomorrow, and Tyler can save the contracts. She held the envelope out, her hand trembling. The sheer audacity of the demand hung in the air between us. She was not asking for a loan. She was demanding I encumber my own hard-earned corporate equity to bail out a man who bought speedboats on credit. You drove 3 hours to hand me loan documents, I said. My voice remained level, devoid of any fluctuation. I did not match her volume. Aria, we are family. She raised her pitch, ensuring the executives near the elevator caught the key word. Family helps family. Mom and Dad are sick with worry. You owe us this. You owe us for leaving the way you did. The executives were openly staring now. One of the security guards stepped forward, his hand hovering near his radio, waiting for a signal. Brooke saw the audience. She leaned into the performance. She dropped the envelope onto the small cafe table beside me, buried her face in her hands, and let out a loud, shuddering sob. Please, just sign it. I am begging you. Do not let them throw my family out on the street. She expected me to grab the envelope. She expected me to pull her into a private office to quiet her down. She expected me to negotiate. I looked at her. I did not feel pity. I felt the cold, familiar clarity of an auditor locating the source of a deficit. I picked up the manila envelope. Brooke peeked through her fingers, anticipating the victory. I walked over to the lobby reception desk. The administrative assistant, a young woman named Sarah, looked up, her eyes wide. Sarah, I said, please hand me the phone. Brooke lowered her hands. The tears stopped abruptly. What are you doing? I picked up the receiver and dialed the internal extension for the head of building security. The line connected immediately. This is Aria Dixon, senior partner. I have an unauthorized solicitor in the main lobby causing a disturbance. I need her escorted from the premises immediately. Furthermore, I need her name logged into the restricted access database. She is not to be permitted on Vanguard property under any circumstances. If she attempts to enter the parking garage or the building again, you are authorized to involve the Atlanta police. I hung up the phone. I turned back to Brooke. The security guards moved swiftly. They did not run, but their strides were long and purposeful. They flanked her on either side. One of them, a man twice her size, gestured toward the revolving doors. "Ma'am, it is time to leave." Brooke's face flushed a deep mottled red. The victim persona vanished, replaced instantly by the ugly, venomous entitlement she had harbored since childhood. She snatched the manila envelope off the desk. "You are a sociopath," she hissed. Her voice was no longer trembling. It was sharp and laced with malice. "You sit up here in your glass tower while your own parents are drowning. You think you are untouchable." "I am," I replied. The security guard placed a firm hand on her shoulder, guiding her toward the exit. She jerked away from him, walking backward toward the doors so she could maintain eye contact with me. She pointed a finger at my chest. The entire lobby watched her unravel. "You are going to regret this." She screamed the words, her voice echoing off the terrazzo floor. "Mom is going to ruin you for this. Do you hear me? She is going to tear your life apart." The guards pushed her through the revolving doors. I stood in the lobby and watched her figure distort behind the thick glass as she marched across the plaza toward the parking structure. The executives near the elevator turned back to their conversations, pretending they had not just witnessed a public execution. Sarah, the receptionist, handed me my coffee. It was still warm. I thanked her, walked to the elevator bank, and swiped my access badge. The doors slid closed, sealing out the noise of the lobby. Brooke had failed to secure the money. The physical ambush had been neutralized, but as the elevator ascended to the executive floor, the adrenaline slowly receded, leaving a distinct sense of gravity in its wake. Brooke was a scout. She was the initial probing attack. She lacked the intellect to orchestrate a true takedown. Her final threat was not an empty scream. It was a promise. Helen Dixon was the architect of my original exile. If Brooke returned to Savannah empty-handed, Helen would not accept the defeat. She would not rely on voicemails or unannounced visits. She would escalate the conflict to a level that threatened everything I had built. The front door was locked. Now they were going to try to break the windows. The fallout from the lobby ambush did not take long to materialize. Brooke's failure to secure the loan documents signaled a tactical shift in Savannah. If they could not force my hand in person, they would attempt to isolate me socially. They deployed the proxies. Psychologists call them flying monkeys. I call them collateral damage. My phone began to vibrate on my desk the following morning. The incoming numbers were unsaved, but the area codes were all from coastal Georgia. The first message arrived at 9 o'clock. It was from Aunt Clara, my mother's older sister. Clara was a woman who equated morality with keeping up appearances. She had not reached out when I left 8 years ago. She had not asked if I had food or shelter. Now, she was suddenly deeply invested in my spiritual well-being. The text read, "Arya, your mother is inconsolable. I cannot believe you threw your own sister out of your office with security guards. Family is family. You have millions of dollars and you are letting your parents lose their business. God sees your greed." I did not reply. I took a screenshot, opened the portable wireless printer on my credenza, and printed the image. I dated it in red ink and slipped it into the gray accordion folder. 10 minutes later, another message pinged. This one was from Greg, a second cousin who worked at a car dealership in Savannah. "Hey, Arya, heard what happened. Pretty messed up that you are leaving Aunt Helen out to dry when you are sitting on a gold mine. You owe them for raising you." Another screenshot, another printed page. The folder consumed the evidence. By noon, I had logged 11 text messages and 4 lengthy emails to my personal account. The narrative Helen had spun in Savannah was clear and highly coordinated. She had omitted the demand for a $150,000 commercial loan guarantee. Instead, she painted a picture of an arrogant, heartless, corporate elite daughter who had cruelly summoned armed guards to humiliate a grieving sister, asking for a modest, temporary lifeline. The extended family, starved for drama and eager to align with the perceived victims, flooded my digital boundaries with guilt trips. I utilized the calm drama syntax. I did not engage in debates. When Clara sent a follow-up text demanding an explanation, I replied with a single, razor-sharp boundary. Clara, you are repeating a fabricated story you have not verified. Do not contact this number again. I blocked her contact profile. I blocked Greg. I blocked the entire Savannah area code on my personal device. I was not going to drown in their manufactured chaos. But the true danger did not arrive via text message. It arrived at 3 p.m. while I was reviewing international shipping tariffs on my second monitor. My direct office line rang. This was a restricted number. Only Vanguard executives, preferred vendors, and my personal attorney, David, possessed the routing code. The caller ID displayed an unknown local exchange. Assuming it was a vendor bypassing the reception desk, I lifted the receiver. Aria Dixon. There was a long pause. A heavy intake of breath echoed through the earpiece.
Aria, baby.
The voice belonged to Thomas Dixon, my father. I froze. My hand tightened around the receiver. I had not heard his voice since the day I stood in his office and showed him the missing $40,000. Back then he had looked away, too cowardly to defend me. Dad. The word felt foreign in my mouth. It tasted like rust. I am so sorry to call you at work. His tone was fractured. He sounded exhausted, ancient, and broken. I know Brooke came to see you. I told her not to. Your mother is out of control, Aria. She is frantic about the money. The business is failing. We are losing everything. I just want to make this right. I want this nightmare to stop. For a fraction of a second, the armor cracked. The inflection in his voice triggered a deep, dormant childhood reflex, the desire for a parent to protect you, to validate your pain. He sounded like a man who had finally realized the magnitude of his mistakes and was reaching out to surrender. But I am a forensic auditor. I do not listen to the emotion. I listen to the data. I closed my eyes and tuned out the words, focusing entirely on the audio quality. The cadence of his speech was unnatural. It was rehearsed. The pauses were too measured, like a man reading from a script he had memorized in the car. Beneath his voice, underneath the apology, there was a faint, continuous electronic hum, a localized static. He was calling from a speakerphone in a closed room. I did not respond. I waited. The silence stretched between Atlanta and Savannah. Thomas cleared his throat. Aria, are you there? I am here, Thomas. He pushed forward, abandoning the emotional preamble for the core objective. Listen to me. If we can just settle the past, we can move forward. I know you were angry when you left. I know it was hard. But did you really use that $40,000 to start your business? Just tell me the truth. Between us, nobody else has to know. If you used it as seed money, we can just call it an investment. We can work it out. Just say you took it, and I will make your mother back off. The trap sprang shut. The teeth of the steel jaws clamped down on the bait. He was not calling to apologize. He was not calling to surrender. He was calling to execute a legal maneuver. He had a lawyer sitting next to him in that closed room. They were recording the call. They needed me to offer a verbal confirmation, a moment of weakness, an exhausted confession to validate the 8-year-old lie. If I said yes, or even offered an ambiguous apology to end the conversation, the recording would become admissible evidence in a civil suit. They would use my own voice to claim I had embezzled the funds and used them to build my corporate empire. The betrayal was absolute. The man who had stood silently by while I was framed was now actively attempting to participate in my destruction. My forensic instincts took over completely. The lingering childhood vulnerability evaporated. I leaned into the microphone. I did not speak with anger. I spoke with the chilling precision of a corporate executive addressing a hostile entity. Thomas, you are on a speakerphone. The ambient noise indicates you are in a closed room, likely with third-party legal counsel present. Furthermore, the electronic hum indicates you are actively recording this communication. I heard a sharp intake of breath, the rustling of fabric. Someone in the room with him was panicking. Georgia is a two-party consent state, I continued. My voice was ice. Recording a private telephone conversation without the explicit consent of all participating parties is a felony violation of state wiretapping laws. You have just committed a criminal offense. If you or your representatives attempt to contact this office again, I will forward the call logs to the district attorney. Have your counsel contact mine. I placed the receiver back onto the cradle. The line disconnected. I sat back in my ergonomic chair. My pulse was steady. My hands were not shaking. I opened the gray accordion folder, pulled out a blank sheet of paper, and logged the exact time, duration, and substance of the phone call. The Dixons were desperate. They were no longer relying on emotional manipulation or social media guilt trips. They had hired cheap, aggressive legal representation. They were willing to break federal wiretapping statutes to manufacture evidence. They believed they could trick me into handing them the keys to my vault. They had failed to record a confession. But the presence of a lawyer in that room meant they were preparing to file a formal claim. They were going to try to legitimize the 8-year-old lie and drag it into a courtroom. They wanted to attack my professional reputation. They wanted to bleed me dry. The minor skirmishes were over. The proxies had been dismissed. The ambush had failed. Helen and Thomas were now preparing to drop a bomb, and I knew exactly where it was going to land. The warning signs of an incoming attack are rarely subtle. You just have to know how to read the perimeter. After Thomas failed to execute the wiretap, the Savannah area code went entirely dark. No texts from Aunt Clara, no emails from cousins. The sudden cessation of noise did not mean the family had surrendered. It meant they had retreated to consolidate their forces. They were no longer throwing rocks. They were building a siege engine. 72 hours after the phone call, the siege engine arrived at my front door. It was a Saturday morning. I lived in a secure, high-rise condominium building in Midtown. The concierge desk screened all visitors and packages. At 10:15, the intercom buzzed. The concierge informed me that a bonded legal courier was waiting in the lobby with a priority parcel requiring a physical signature. He could not leave it at the desk. I took the elevator down to the marble lobby. The courier was a young man in a polo shirt holding a thick, rigid cardboard mailer. I signed the electronic tablet, took the package, and returned to my apartment. I did not open it immediately. I set it on the kitchen island. I poured a glass of cold water. I looked at the return address label. It bore the name of a law firm located in a strip mall on the outskirts of Savannah. The firm specialized in personal injury, aggressive debt collection, and low-tier civil litigation. It was the kind of firm that operated on volume and intimidation, leveraging the threat of court costs to force quick settlements from terrified targets. I retrieved a brass letter opener from my desk. I slid the blade under the cardboard flap and pulled out a stack of heavy, legal-sized documents. The top page was a formal notice of intent to sue. I read the opening paragraphs. The language was inflated, filled with aggressive legal jargon designed to overwhelm a layperson. But I am not a layperson. I read contracts for a living. I bypassed the bluster and isolated the core claim. Helen and Thomas Dixon were not suing me for the return of the $40,000. Under Georgia law, the statute of limitations for civil theft or conversion had expired 4 years ago. Their strip mall lawyer knew that. A direct claim for stolen funds would be dismissed by a judge before it ever reached a docket. Instead, they had constructed a profound, audacious lie to bypass the statute. They had forged a document. Attached to the notice of intent was a photocopy of a single-page typed contract titled Initial Capital Partnership Agreement. It was dated 8 years ago. The document claimed that the $40,000 withdrawn from the landscaping company was not stolen. It claimed the money was formally provided to me as an initial seed investment to launch my independent logistics career in Atlanta. In exchange for this fictitious seed capital, the document stipulated that Helen and Thomas Dixon retained a perpetual 15% equity stake in any corporate entity I built, managed, or acquired. At the bottom of the page were 2 signatures, Thomas Dixon, and a flawless, intricate forgery of my own signature. They had taken the lie they told the church and mutated it into a financial weapon. They were claiming 15% of my corporate net worth. They were claiming a piece of Vanguard Freight Solutions. The final page of the packet contained the extortion demand. The lawyer stated that his clients were prepared to file this lawsuit in the Fulton County Superior Court, exposing my alleged breach of fiduciary duty to the public. However, the letter offered an alternative resolution. If I agreed to co-sign a commercial loan guarantee of $150,000 to satisfy the debts of Tyler's construction firm, the Dixons would consider the partnership equity fully bought out and drop the impending litigation. Sign the papers. The 3 words from the voicemails finally had context. They did not want 15% of Vanguard. They knew they could never survive corporate discovery during a trial. They just wanted the immediate cash injection to save Brooke's failing lifestyle. They were using the threat of a massive public corporate lawsuit as leverage to force me to sign the loan. I placed the documents back onto the kitchen island. I did not feel the cold detachment I usually maintained. I felt a sharp, localized spike of genuine danger. This was not a social media post. This was a legal instrument designed to destroy the architecture of my life. I picked up my phone and called David. He answered on the second ring. He was at a driving range, the sound of a golf club striking a ball echoing through the receiver. "David, I have a situation. I need you to look at a document." His tone shifted instantly from weekend casual to corporate counsel. "Send it over the secure portal." I scanned the notice of intent and the forged partnership agreement. 10 minutes later, David called me back. The sound of the driving range was gone. He was sitting in his car. "Arya, this is garbage." He spoke quickly, assessing the threat level. "The drafting is amateurish. The terms are unenforceable. No judge is going to uphold a perpetual equity claim based on a single-page, unnotarized document that magically surfaces after 8 years of zero communication. We can get a handwriting expert to invalidate the signature in an afternoon. Legally, this is frivolous. I can draft a motion to dismiss with prejudice by Monday morning." I exhaled, feeling a fraction of the tension release. "So we fight it. We win it," David corrected. "But fighting it is where the problem lies." He paused. The silence on the line felt heavier than the words. "Arya, you are a senior partner at a firm preparing for a major international merger. Vanguard's board of directors requires absolute transparency. If this Savannah lawyer files this lawsuit in Fulton County, it becomes public record. It enters the dockets. The moment a lawsuit claiming you breached a financial partnership and embezzled corporate equity hits the public domain, the Vanguard Ethics Committee is legally obligated to react." I closed my eyes. The implications crystallized. "They will suspend me." David sighed. "Yes, the board will place you on administrative leave pending an internal investigation. It is standard corporate protocol to protect the merger. You will be locked out of the network. You will lose your security clearance. The investigation will eventually clear you, but the process takes months. The PR optics of a senior partner being sued by her own parents for fraud could jeopardize the merger entirely." My parents had found the exact coordinates of my Achilles heel. They knew they could not win a trial. They did not need to. They only needed to file the paperwork. The mere accusation, logged into a public court system, would trigger an automatic corporate reflex that would strip me of my title, my office, and my professional identity. Helen Dixon was banking on the fact that I would calculate the risk and choose the cheapest exit. A $150,000 loan guarantee was a fraction of what I stood to lose if the board suspended me during a merger. She expected me to pay the ransom to protect my career. If we do not respond to this demand, I asked David, what is their timeline? The letter gives you 5 business days to sign the loan documents, David replied. If you refuse, they file the suit on Friday. I looked at the forged signature on the kitchen island. They were going to use my own success as a blade to cut my throat. Draft the response, David, I said. Are we settling? He sounded disappointed. No, we are not paying a ransom. Tell them we reject the terms and welcome the discovery phase. David let out a low whistle. Arya, if we call their bluff, they might actually file it. You could lose your seat at the table. I know the cost, I replied, but if I sign that loan, I am admitting the forged document is real. I will be paying them protection money for the rest of my life. Let them file. I hung up the phone. I walked to the fireproof cabinet, opened the drawer, and dropped the extortion packet into the gray folder. The battle lines were drawn. The family was preparing to launch their missile, and I was choosing to stand directly at ground zero. The impact was going to be catastrophic. But I needed them to deploy their weapon before I could dismantle the launch pad. David drafted the rejection letter and sent it via certified overnight mail to the strip mall law firm in Savannah. The message was unequivocal. We denied the existence of any partnership, rejected the extortion demand, and warned that any further contact regarding the forged document would be met with severe legal consequences. I expected them to file the lawsuit. I expected a process server to arrive at my office. I spent the next 72 hours bracing for the bureaucratic machinery of the Fulton County court system to engage. I underestimated Helen Dixon. I assumed she would play by the rules of engagement dictated by her own lawyer. I forgot that my mother viewed rules as obstacles meant for other people. When the deadline passed and the signed loan guarantee did not arrive, Helen realized the legal threat was not generating the immediate panic she required. The lawsuit would take weeks to file and months to process. Brooks' creditors were calling daily. Tyler's business was hemorrhaging cash. They did not have months. They needed collateral damage, and they needed it instantly. If the threat of the explosion did not make me surrender, Helen decided to detonate the bomb inside my own house. It happened on a Thursday morning. I was in the middle of a high-level video conference with 3 supply chain executives from Rotterdam. We were finalizing the logistics for the upcoming corporate merger. At 10:45, a calendar notification pinged on my primary monitor. The meeting invite was from Richard Vance, the Chief Executive Officer of Vanguard Freight Solutions. The subject line read, Urgent Security Review, Required Attendance. The location was his private suite on the top floor. The time was 11 o'clock, 15 minutes. A summons from the CEO with 15 minutes notice was not an invitation for a performance review. It was an execution. I excused myself from the video call, attributing the sudden departure to a critical infrastructure delay. I walked out of my office. The atmosphere on the executive floor had shifted. The usual hum of corporate activity felt muted. As I walked past the glass-walled conference rooms, several junior partners averted their eyes. The silence was thick, heavy, and distinctly radioactive. I reached the top floor. Richard Vance's executive assistant did not offer her usual warm greeting. She nodded tightly toward the heavy oak double doors. Go right in, Arya. I entered the office. Richard sat behind a vast mahogany desk. He was a man who built his career on risk mitigation. He did not tolerate variables he could not control. To his left sat the head of human resources. To his right stood Vanguard's external public relations consultant. David, my internal counsel, was notably absent. That was the most terrifying detail in the room. They had deliberately excluded my strongest ally from the meeting. Close the door, Arya, Richard said. His voice lacked any conversational warmth. Have a seat. I sat in the leather chair opposite the desk. I kept my posture rigid. I did not ask why I was there. Richard turned his monitor toward me. Displayed on the screen was an email. I looked at the header. It had been sent simultaneously to Richard, the entire board of directors, and 6 of Vanguard's top-tier clients. The sender address belonged to Brooke. Helen had figured out the standardized corporate email naming convention: first initial, last name, @vanguardfreight.com. It was a simple formula, easily exploited by anyone with a search engine and malicious intent. The email subject line read, "Fraud alert regarding senior partner Aria Dixon." The body of the text was a masterfully crafted piece of corporate sabotage. It stated that I was currently under investigation by a legal entity in Savannah for embezzling seed capital to launch my career. It claimed I had defrauded my initial investors, who happened to be my own family. Attached to the email was a high-resolution PDF scan of the forged initial capital partnership agreement. I felt a cold, metallic sensation spread through my chest. The walls of the office seemed to pull inward. The precise, controlled environment I had spent 8 years constructing was disintegrating in real time. "This arrived at 8:30 this morning," Richard stated. "The PR team has spent the last 2 hours intercepting the client emails and issuing non-disclosure hold requests." "Richard," I began, keeping my voice entirely level despite the adrenaline flooding my system, "this is a coordinated extortion attempt. The document attached is a forgery. My family is attempting to leverage a false claim to force me to co-sign a commercial loan for my sister's failing business. I have already engaged internal counsel to reject their demands." "I know," Richard replied. "David briefed me on the Savannah situation yesterday. He assured me it was a frivolous civil matter that would not breach the corporate threshold." He was wrong. He leaned forward, lacing his fingers together. The PR consultant shifted uncomfortably. "Aria, I do not care about the dynamics of your family. I do not care if this document is forged. I care about the optical vulnerability of this firm. We are 3 weeks away from finalizing an international merger that will double our market capitalization. The investors in Rotterdam demand absolute financial transparency. If they catch wind that one of my senior partners is embroiled in an active embezzlement dispute, even a fraudulent one, they will trigger a halt on the merger to conduct an independent audit." The Human Resources Director pushed a manila folder across the desk. "Therefore," Richard continued, "the board held an emergency remote session at 10 o'clock. Effective immediately, you are placed on a mandatory, unpaid administrative leave pending a full internal investigation into the origins of this partnership claim." The words landed like physical blows. Unpaid administrative leave. It was the corporate equivalent of an exile. It was the exact maneuver Helen had designed. She knew that in the corporate sector, the accusation is often more lethal than the verdict. "Richard, you are penalizing me for being targeted by a scam. If you suspend me, you validate their attack. You show them that the firm is vulnerable to external blackmail." "I am protecting the merger, Aria. The decision is final. You will surrender your security badge, your corporate laptop, and your company-issued mobile device. The IT department has already revoked your network access. You are not to contact any Vanguard clients or personnel during the suspension period. You will be escorted to your office to collect your personal belongings, and then security will walk you to the parking garage." I looked at the manila folder. It contained the suspension protocols, the non-disclosure agreements, the termination of access forms. They were stripping me of everything: the title, the authority, the security I had traded my youth to build. I was right back where I started 8 years ago, sitting in a room, watching people in power choose the path of least resistance, while I took the fall. I did not argue. Pleading with Richard Vance would be as effective as arguing with a spreadsheet. He had made his calculation. I was the liability, and I was being excised from the equation. I signed the forms. I placed my security badge on the desk. I handed over my phone. A security guard escorted me down to my floor. The walk felt endless. The junior partners who had looked away earlier were now openly staring. The Whisper network was already operating at maximum efficiency. In the span of 2 hours, the narrative had been written. Aria Dixon, the stoic logistics architect, had been walked out of the building for financial fraud. I packed a small cardboard box with a few personal items, a framed photograph of a hiking trip, a specialized calculator. I left the rest. The guard walked me to the subterranean parking structure. The heavy steel doors locked behind me with a loud, definitive click. I stood alone in the dim concrete garage. The silence was absolute. My corporate phone was gone. My email access was severed. I could not call David. I could not access my client files. The fortress I had built was entirely dismantled. Helen and Brooke had won. They had found the single thread holding my life together, and they had pulled it until the entire fabric unraveled. I walked to my car, opened the trunk, and placed the cardboard box inside. I sat in the driver's seat and stared at the steering wheel. I was suspended. I was isolated. The extortion strategy had worked flawlessly. They had taken the one thing I worked 8 years to build, and they had done it without ever stepping foot inside a courtroom. I drove out of the garage and merged into the dense Atlanta traffic. I did not know how to fight an enemy who was willing to burn down the entire city just to collect the ashes. The listener might wonder how a woman stripped of her resources, locked out of her own company, and publicly disgraced could possibly mount a defense against an opponent who had already secured a total victory. The answer was sitting in my apartment, locked in a fireproof cabinet. I had lost the corporate battle, but they had forced me onto a battlefield where the only rule was absolute destruction. And that was a landscape I knew how to navigate. The drive back to my Midtown condominium took 40 minutes. The silence in the car was heavy, unmitigated by the usual stream of conference calls and logistics updates that dominated my commute. The sudden absence of corporate responsibility felt like stepping off a treadmill that had been running at maximum speed for 8 years. I parked in my designated spot, carried the small cardboard box up to my apartment, and set it on the kitchen island. I did not break. I did not pour a drink or collapse onto the sofa. The emotional shock of the suspension had already calcified into a rigid, clinical focus. Panic is a luxury for those who have a safety net. I had none. I walked directly into my home office, unlocked the fireproof cabinet, and pulled out the gray accordion folder. I set it on the desk. The fraying canvas edges, the neatly labeled tabs, the thick stacks of paper. This was my arsenal. Helen and Brooke believed they had disarmed me by stripping away my corporate title. They failed to understand that the title was just a byproduct. The real weapon was my methodology. I am an auditor. I dismantle structures to find the hidden flaws. And now I had nothing but time to dismantle theirs. I needed to establish a secure line of communication. Vanguard had confiscated my company-issued phone, so I booted up my personal laptop and sent an encrypted email to David's private address. I instructed him to meet me at a neutral location, not a coffee shop, not his firm. We met in a quiet, dimly lit booth at a high-end steakhouse near Buckhead that rarely saw foot traffic before 5 o'clock. David slid into the booth opposite me. He looked older than he had the day before. The stress of the Vanguard boardroom had settled into the lines around his eyes. He ordered black coffee. I ordered sparkling water. "Aria, I am furious," he started, keeping his voice low. "Richard Vance panicked. He sacrificed you to placate the Rotterdam investors. It was a cowardly, reactionary move, and I told the board exactly that." "I know," I replied. "Richard is irrelevant right now. He is managing his own risk. We need to manage mine. Vanguard requires an internal investigation to clear me. We are going to conduct it for them, and we are going to make it bulletproof." David stirred his coffee, staring at the dark liquid. The forged partnership agreement is a joke, but the email blast elevated it to a reputational threat. To get you reinstated before the merger closes, we have to prove the underlying claim is a complete fabrication. We have to prove you did not steal the $40,000 8 years ago. If we invalidate the core accusation, the extortion plot unravels entirely. Exactly. I pulled a slim manila folder from my bag and slid it across the table. I need you to retain a private investigator, not a standard background check service. I need a forensic financial specialist, someone who can trace a wire transfer through a maze of LLCs and shell accounts. David opened the folder. Inside were the original landscaping company ledgers I had taken the night I left Savannah. The vendor routing numbers, the exact dates, the $40,000 discrepancy. This is a good start, David said, analyzing the columns. But accessing 8-year-old bank records from a private company without a subpoena is incredibly difficult. Helen and Thomas are not going to hand over their books voluntarily. They do not have to, I said. I pointed to a printed public record filing I had placed behind the ledgers. Brooke and Tyler filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy 3 weeks ago. When you file for federal bankruptcy protection, your entire financial history, including past business assets, vendor payments, and significant inbound transfers, becomes subject to discovery by the bankruptcy trustee. Their financial perimeter is completely exposed. The PI does not need to hack into my parents' accounts. He just needs to pull Brooke and Tyler's public bankruptcy filings and trace the cash flow backward. David looked up, a slow, predatory smile forming. That is brilliant. The bankruptcy filing is a backdoor into their entire financial ecosystem. He closed the folder. I know a guy. XIRS Criminal Division. He operates quietly and he operates fast. It will cost you a significant retainer. Fund it through my personal accounts, I instructed. But David, there is one more thing. Proving Brooke stole the money for her wedding might clear my name regarding the original theft, but it might not be enough to satisfy Richard Vance. The board needs to see that the current threat is a malicious extortion plot. They need to see that my parents forged a legal document to blackmail a corporate officer. We need undeniable proof of the conspiracy. David nodded slowly. You are talking about intent. We need to prove they knew the document was fake when they emailed it to the board. We are not looking for an apology anymore, David. I leaned back in the booth. The cool leather felt anchoring against my spine. We are looking for annihilation. I want the Savannah narrative destroyed so thoroughly that my mother can never show her face in that town again. I will make the call, David said. He slid out of the booth, taking the manila folder with him. Keep your head down, Arya. Do not engage with any family members. Let the investigator do the digging. For the next 2 weeks, my apartment became a war room. The private investigator, a man named Miller, proved to be worth every dollar of his exorbitant fee. Because Brooke and Tyler's bankruptcy case involved multiple failed construction loans and allegations of mismanaged vendor funds, the federal trustee had demanded extensive documentation, stretching back nearly a decade. Miller legally accessed the public filings and began to reconstruct the timeline. I spent my suspension analyzing the data dumps Miller sent over the encrypted portal. I treated my own trauma like a supply chain discrepancy. I dug through thousands of pages of PDF documents, credit card statements, catering invoices, bank routing logs. I was searching for the exact footprint of the $40,000. I was looking for the receipt that proved Brooke had used the emergency fund to pay for the luxury venue and the imported orchids. It was grueling, monotonous work. The sheer volume of financial incompetence displayed in Tyler's business records was staggering. They had lived in a persistent state of denial, shifting debt from one high-interest account to another, masking the inevitable collapse with leased sports cars and expensive vacations. They were a textbook example of a house built on sand. But as I sifted through the debris of their ruined lives, a strange pattern began to emerge. I was looking for a direct line from my parents' landscaping account to Brooke's wedding vendors. I expected to find a wire transfer labeled with Brooke's name or Tyler's signature. I expected the paper trail to confirm the theory I had held for 8 years. Instead, the numbers started to fracture. The routing codes did not align. The dates of the vendor payments did not match the date the $40,000 vanished from the emergency fund. I sat at my kitchen island at 2 in the morning, staring at 3 different spreadsheets on my dual monitors. The glow of the screens illuminated the dark room. I cross-referenced the data again. I ran the algorithms. I checked the routing numbers against the bank identifiers Miller had provided. The math did not lie. The numbers are absolute. They do not possess ego or pride. They simply exist as a factual record of human behavior, and the record was glaringly inconsistent. The $40,000 that disappeared from the landscaping company ledgers did not go to the luxury wedding venue. It did not go to the caterer. It did not pay for the custom silk gown. The wedding vendors had been paid, but the funding had come from a series of high-interest personal loans Tyler had secured months prior. The $40,000 from the emergency fund had been wired to an entirely different entity, an entity located out of state. I felt a cold prickle of realization traverse the back of my neck. The foundational narrative of my exile was shifting beneath my feet. I had spent 8 years believing I was sacrificed to protect the golden child's perfect wedding. I believed Brooke was the thief, and my parents were her willing accomplices. But the forensic evidence I was staring at painted a vastly different, far more sinister picture. The private investigator had not just found the missing money. He had unearthed a secret so profound, so deeply humiliating, that my parents had been willing to destroy their own daughter to keep it buried. The true origin of the $40,000 deficit was about to be exposed, and the revelation was going to detonate the entire Savannah storyline. The blue light from the dual monitors reflected off the kitchen island. It was 3:15 a.m. I had been staring at the routing numbers for over an hour, trying to force the digits into a narrative that made sense. But forensic accounting does not yield to expectations. It only yields to facts. And the facts on my screen were actively dismantling an 8-year-old reality. My phone vibrated on the desk, shattering the quiet. It was a secure line text from Miller, the private investigator. The message was brief. Need you and David on a conference call. Now. I set up the encrypted bridge. David connected a moment later, his voice thick with sleep. I am here, David said, clearing his throat. What did you find, Miller? I have the origin point of the wire transfer, Miller stated. The audio quality was crisp, masking any emotion. The $40,000 that left the landscaping company's emergency fund 8 years ago. I traced it through the bankruptcy filings and cross-referenced it with federal fraud databases. I leaned closer to the speaker. Did it go to Brooke's wedding vendors? No, Miller replied. That is the thing. Brooke and Tyler did not touch that money. Tyler funded the wedding through a series of subprime personal loans he secured against his future construction contracts. The $40,000 from your parents' business account was wired directly to an offshore holding company registered in Cyprus. David audibly exhaled. Cyprus. Why would a mid-sized landscaping firm in Savannah wire capital to an offshore shell account? They wouldn't, Miller said, unless they were the victims of a targeted advance fee fraud scheme. The silence on the line was profound. My mind raced, pulling fragments of memories from the months leading up to my departure. My father whispering on his cell phone in the garage. My mother holding glossy brochures for exclusive retirement communities they could not afford. The sudden, unexplained tension that permeated the house, which I had attributed to the stress of Brooke's upcoming nuptials. Miller continued laying out the timeline. 8 years ago, right before the wedding, Thomas and Helen Dixon engaged with a sophisticated real estate investment group, promising guaranteed, high-yield returns on distressed commercial properties. It was a classic scam. The investors required a $40,000 initial buy-in to secure the portfolio. Your parents authorized the wire transfer from the emergency reserve, expecting a massive payout within 30 days. The payout never arrived. The holding company vanished, taking the money with them. I felt the blood drain from my face. They lost it. They did not spend it. They lost it to a scam. Yes, Miller confirmed. And the timing could not have been worse. Brooke was about to marry into a prominent, wealthy family in Savannah. Tyler's parents expected the Dixons to cover a significant portion of the wedding costs to maintain appearances. Your parents were suddenly staring at a massive financial deficit and the imminent threat of profound social humiliation. If they admitted they had been conned out of their emergency fund by a fraudulent email scheme, they would have been the laughingstock of the country club. They needed to explain the missing capital without admitting their own sheer financial incompetence. They needed a scapegoat, David said. His tone shifted from sleepy corporate counsel to a prosecutor who had just located the murder weapon. They could not blame Brooke. She was the golden child marrying into money. They needed someone expendable. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. The air in the apartment felt thin, insufficient. I was the bookkeeper. The words tasted like ash. I was the quiet one. I sat by the loading dock and balanced the ledgers. When the money vanished, they realized they could construct a narrative that protected their pride and explained the deficit simultaneously. They framed you, David stated, verbalizing the ugly, undeniable truth. They did not just throw you under the bus to protect Brooke. They threw you under the bus to cover up their own staggering idiocy. They sacrificed their 24-year-old daughter because they were too terrified to admit to their new in-laws that they had been swindled. My entire exile was not a tragic misunderstanding. It was not a case of parental favoritism gone horribly wrong. It was a calculated, cold-blooded cover-up. Helen Dixon had stood in the church foyer, dabbing her eyes with a lace handkerchief, receiving the pity and admiration of the congregation, while knowing the entire time that she was the one who had wired the money to a scammer. She had called me a thief to hide the fact that she was a fool. I stared at the PDF document Miller had uploaded to the secure portal. It was the original wire transfer authorization. It bore my father's signature. It listed the destination routing number in Cyprus. It was the definitive, irrefutable proof of their guilt. "Miller," I said, my voice dropping to a register that barely registered above a whisper, "can you authenticate this document? Can it withstand legal scrutiny?" "It is a certified bank record obtained through federal bankruptcy discovery," Miller replied. "It is bulletproof. No court in the country would dismiss it. Thank you." I ended the call. I sat in the glow of the monitors. The emotional detachment I had cultivated over 8 years, the careful, measured stoicism that had propelled me to the top of Vanguard Freight Solutions, did not break. It crystallized. The lingering anger I had harbored toward Brooke evaporated. Brooke was just a pawn in their ecosystem, oblivious to the fact that her parents had allowed her to hate her sister to protect their own fragile egos. The true architects of my destruction were Thomas and Helen. They had stripped me of my family, my reputation in Savannah, and now they were attempting to strip me of my corporate career to force a bailout for the very lifestyle they had almost bankrupted themselves to protect. The dynamic of the conflict had fundamentally altered. I was no longer an innocent victim trying to clear my name against a false accusation. I was an executioner who had just been handed the signed confession of the guilty party. The extortion lawsuit, the forged partnership agreement, the emails to my board of directors, they were all built on a foundation of profound vulnerability. I opened the gray accordion folder. I placed the authenticated wire transfer document inside, right next to the forged extortion demand. David called back 2 minutes later. "Aria," he said softly, "I am so sorry. This is a level of betrayal that is difficult to process." "I do not need to process it, David. I need to weaponize it." "What is the play?" he asked. The corporate attorney was fully engaged now. "We have the proof to clear you with the board. We can submit this to Richard Vance tomorrow and have you reinstated by the end of the week. We can forward the forged documents to the district attorney in Savannah and let them handle the criminal charges for extortion." No. I closed the folder and secured the elastic band. If we hand this to the board or the police, the story gets buried in bureaucratic procedure. Helen and Thomas will spin it. They will claim they were confused or that their lawyer acted without their consent. They will find a way to maintain their victim status in Savannah. They will never face the social humiliation they inflicted on me. I stood up and walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over the dark expanse of Atlanta. I want them in a room, I stated. I want them sitting across a table, arrogant and confident, believing they have won. I want to watch the exact moment they realize the illusion is over. I want to dismantle their lives with the same public precision they used to dismantle mine. David remained silent for a long moment, evaluating the risk. How do we force them into a room? The lawsuit is an empty threat. If we ignore it, they might just continue harassing the board. We do not ignore it. I turned away from the window. We bait the trap. The anger the listener feels on my behalf, the burning desire for a localized, absolute retaliation, is a potent fuel. But anger must be directed. It must be focused into a laser to cut through the armor of an enemy who operates entirely on perception. I had the weapon. I had the target. Now, I just needed to construct the perfect venue for the demolition. And as I reviewed the commercial property records tied to Brooks' bankruptcy filings, a brilliant, devastating piece of dramatic irony presented itself. The venue was already built, and they were already inside it. The plan required absolute precision. I had the Cypress wire transfer. I had the forged partnership agreement. I had the timeline of their financial collapse. But information alone is inert until you find the correct leverage point to apply it. While David drafted the strategy to bait them into a formal mediation, I remained at the kitchen island, scrolling through the remaining bankruptcy files Miller had provided. The documents detailed the rapid liquidation of Brooke and Tyler's assets, foreclosed properties, repossessed vehicles, canceled credit lines. Amidst the chaos of their personal ruin, I found the Schedule G filings from my parents' landscaping company. Brooke had attached them as part of the bankruptcy proceedings to prove the family business could no longer subsidize her debts. I scanned the list of the landscaping company's current liabilities: vendor debts, equipment leases, utility arrears. My eyes caught on a specific line item under commercial rent obligations. The address listed for their primary operational warehouse was 402 Industrial Parkway, Savannah, Georgia. I stopped scrolling. The address felt strangely familiar. It resonated with a specific memory from my early tenure as a senior partner at Vanguard. 4 years ago, as Vanguard aggressively expanded its southeastern shipping routes, we initiated a localized real estate acquisition phase. We targeted distressed commercial industrial parks near major port cities to convert into distribution hubs. Savannah was a prime target. To avoid artificially inflating the local market prices when a massive corporate entity began buying up property, I established an anonymous subsidiary management trust. I named the holding company Gray Folder Holdings, LLC. It was a private joke, a nod to the archive in my fireproof cabinet. I minimized the bankruptcy PDF and opened a secure tab. I logged into the proprietary real estate management portal Vanguard utilized to track subsidiary assets. I navigated to the Savannah portfolio and entered 402 Industrial Parkway into the search field. The database buffered for 2 seconds before generating the property profile. The screen displayed an aerial satellite image of a sprawling, metal-sided warehouse complex surrounded by a chain-link fence. The tenant of record was listed as Dixon Landscaping Supply. The ultimate dramatic irony crystallized in the dim light of my apartment. I leaned forward, resting my forehead against my hands, letting out a low, humorless laugh that echoed off the quartz countertops. I was their landlord. For the past 4 years, Thomas and Helen Dixon had been mailing a substantial commercial rent check to a post office box in Atlanta. They believed they were paying a faceless, bureaucratic holding corporation. They had no idea that every single month their money was funneled through the LLC and deposited directly into the Vanguard portfolio I managed. They had been subsidizing the very empire they claimed to have seeded. I scrolled down to the tenant ledger. The irony deepened, transforming from a cosmic joke into a devastating tactical advantage. The ledger displayed a glaring red banner across the top of the screen. Account delinquent. Because of the massive capital they had drained to keep Brooke and Tyler afloat, the landscaping company had exhausted its operating reserves. Thomas and Helen were currently 90 days past due on their commercial lease. The automated system had already generated 2 generic warning notices. According to the strict terms of the commercial lease agreement Vanguard utilized for all subsidiary properties, a tenant 90 days in arrears was in material breach of contract. Gray Folder Holdings, LLC, possessed the immediate, unmitigated legal right to terminate the lease and initiate eviction proceedings without further notice. The listener now possesses a critical piece of information that the family lacks. For the remainder of this narrative, every arrogant demand Helen makes, every smug threat Brooke issues, and every forged document their strip mall lawyer produces is framed against the backdrop of this colossal, invisible trap. They are standing on a trap door, holding the rope, threatening to hang me if I do not surrender, completely unaware that I control the lever beneath their feet. I printed the tenant ledger. I printed a copy of the original commercial lease agreement bearing Thomas Dixon's signature. I printed the deed proving Gray Folder Holdings, LLC owned the physical land. I added the stack of documents to the gray accordion folder. The archive was no longer just a defensive record. It was a weapon of mass destruction. I called David back. It was 4:30 a.m. He answered immediately, the sound of a keyboard clacking in the background. "David," I said, "I have the venue." He stopped typing. "What do you mean? I own their warehouse," I stated. I explained the subsidiary structure, the address, and the 90-day delinquency. I heard a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. "Aria, that is lethal. If they sue their own landlord while in material breach of their lease, they forfeit any legal protections they might have had under Georgia commercial tenancy laws." "I know. The extortion lawsuit is not a threat anymore. It is an invitation." "How do you want to play it?" David asked. His voice carried the distinct cadence of a predator tracking a scent. "We need to formalize their extortion attempt on the record before we drop the hammer," I instructed. "If we just evict them, they will spin the narrative. They will claim a faceless corporation crushed their small business. We need them to publicly commit to the forged partnership agreement in front of a neutral third party. We need to bait them into a room." David understood the assignment. "We offer a settlement," he suggested. "We draft a response to their notice of intent to sue. We offer a nuisance payout, something substantial enough to trigger their greed, but small enough to insult them. It will make them believe you are terrified of the PR fallout and desperate to make the problem disappear quietly." $50,000, I said. "Offer them $50,000 to drop the lawsuit and sign a non-disclosure agreement. Require a mandatory pre-trial mediation session to formalize the paperwork. They will jump at it," David confirmed. $50,000 gives Brooke breathing room with her creditors, and it validates Helen's belief that she holds the power. They will walk into that mediation room convinced they have broken you. Draft the letter. Send it to their lawyer by noon today. Demand the mediation take place in Savannah. I want them on their home turf. I want them to feel entirely secure. I ended the call and closed my laptop. The dawn was breaking over Atlanta, painting the skyline in shades of gray and pale gold. The suspension from Vanguard no longer felt like an exile. It felt like a necessary quiet before the storm. I had the time, the resources, and the unassailable proof required to execute the demolition. The bait was set. The nuisance settlement offer would be delivered to the strip mall law firm within hours. Helen, Thomas, and Brooke would review the document, and their inherent arrogance would blind them to the trap. They would interpret the offer as a surrender. They would assume the corporate executive had folded under pressure. But before the mediation could occur, the family's hubris would propel them into a final, catastrophic miscalculation. Believing they had already secured their victory, they would attempt to humiliate me in the one arena they felt they still controlled. They were going to crash my territory, ignorant of the fact that they were walking directly into the crosshairs of an opponent who had already secured their total annihilation. The psychology of a grifter relies heavily on momentum. If you disrupt their momentum, they panic. But if you accelerate it, if you feed their delusion of control, they will sprint blindly off a cliff. David understood this implicitly. He drafted the red herring settlement offer with the precise tone of a corporate lawyer desperate to mitigate a public relations disaster. The letter was delivered to the strip mall law firm on a Wednesday. The language was deliberately weak. It stated that while Vanguard Freight Solutions and its senior partner, Aria Dixon, vehemently denied the validity of the initial capital partnership agreement, the firm recognized the potential disruption a public lawsuit could cause to impending corporate restructuring. Therefore, to expedite a resolution and avoid protracted litigation, we offered a one-time, non-negotiable nuisance settlement of $50,000. The payout was contingent upon the immediate withdrawal of the notice of intent to sue and the signing of a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement. The final stipulation required all parties to attend a mandatory, binding mediation session in Savannah the following Friday to execute the documents on the record. David forwarded me the tracking receipt. The bait was in the water. Within 4 hours, David received a reply from the family's attorney. The response was predictably pompous. The lawyer stated that his clients found the $50,000 offer insulting, given the alleged 15% equity stake, but they were willing to attend the mediation in Savannah to negotiate a more equitable figure. They took the bait, David told me over the phone. He sounded almost bored by how easy it was. They think they are going to squeeze you for more in the room. They think you are bleeding out and they just need to turn the tourniquet. Let them think that, I replied. Book a neutral mediator, a retired judge preferably, someone who understands the severity of forged financial documents. I spent the next 48 hours preparing the payload. I did not rely on digital files. Technology can fail. Hard copies are indisputable. I stood in my home office and arranged the documents on my desk in the exact order I intended to present them. First, the original landscaping company ledgers showing the $40,000 deficit. Second, the certified Cypress wire transfer authorization obtained by Miller, bearing my father's signature. Third, the forged partnership agreement they had emailed to my board of directors. Fourth, the commercial lease agreement for the Savannah warehouse. Finally, the deed proving Greyfolder Holdings LLC owned the property, alongside the tenant ledger displaying their 90-day delinquency. I punched holes in the heavy cardstock and secured the documents into thick, transparent binders. I created 3 identical sets, one for the mediator, one for their lawyer, and one for the table. I placed the binders into my structured leather briefcase. I locked the brass clasps. On Thursday morning, I loaded my suitcase and the briefcase into the trunk of my car. I merged onto Interstate 75, heading south. The 3-hour drive to Savannah was a journey backward in time. As the dense urban sprawl of Atlanta surrendered to the flat, pine-lined highways of the coastal plains, the physical environment triggered a cascade of sensory memories. The humidity clinging to the windshield, the smell of salt marsh and damp earth seeping through the air vents. I had not traversed this highway since the night I left on a Greyhound bus. I had been 24 years old, terrified, holding 2 crumpled bills, believing the narrative my mother had written for me. I was 32 now. The fear was gone, replaced by a cold, operational calculus. I was not returning to my hometown to seek closure or demand an apology. I was returning to conduct an audit. I arrived in Savannah in the early afternoon. I bypassed the historic downtown district and navigated toward the industrial sectors. I wanted to verify the target before the mediation. I turned onto Industrial Parkway. The area was a landscape of aging infrastructure, corrugated metal warehouses, and cracked asphalt. I pulled my car to the shoulder, a block away from number 402. I left the engine running. The Dixon Landscaping Supply Warehouse looked exactly as it had 8 years ago, only significantly more weathered. The painted logo on the side of the building was peeling. Several commercial trucks were parked haphazardly near the loading docks. Through the chain-link fence, I could see pallets of fertilizer and stacked paving stones. This was the epicenter of their pride. This concrete and metal structure was the reason they had sacrificed me to a fraud scheme. They had needed to protect the illusion of this business at all costs. And now, the business was hollow, a decaying shell sitting on land they did not own, operating on borrowed time. I watched a forklift move across the yard. I did not feel a sense of nostalgia. I felt the profound, satisfying weight of the dramatic irony. They were inside that building right now, likely celebrating the impending mediation, convinced they were about to extract a massive payout from the daughter they had exiled. They were standing on the trap door. I put the car in drive and navigated to my hotel in the historic district. I checked in, requested a quiet room on an upper floor, and ordered room service. I reviewed the document binders one final time. Every date aligned. Every signature was authenticated. The sequence of destruction was perfectly calibrated. David arrived in Savannah later that evening. He met me in the hotel lobby lounge. He wore a sharp, custom-tailored suit that projected an aura of expensive, unyielding authority. He carried a slim leather portfolio. "The mediator is confirmed," David said, taking a seat opposite me. "Judge Harrison. He retired from the Superior Court 5 years ago. He is a strict constructionist. He does not tolerate procedural games, and he has a distinct disdain for fraudulent filings. He is the perfect audience for tomorrow." "Good." I sipped my sparkling water. "Have they attempted any further contact?" "No," David replied. "Their lawyer is probably advising them to stay quiet to build tension. They are banking on you walking into that room tomorrow exhausted and desperate to settle." I smiled, a tight, humorless expression. Let them bank on it. The tension in the air was palpable. It was the electric charge that precedes a lightning strike. The listener knows what resides inside my leather briefcase. The listener knows the Cypress wire transfer will expose the 8-year-old lie. The listener knows the commercial deed will strip the family of their business. The anticipation of watching the architects of my ruin walk proudly into a slaughterhouse of their own making is a delicious, agonizing wait. But before the mediation could commence the following morning, Helen Dixon's inherent need for public dominance compelled her to make one final, catastrophic maneuver. Believing the nuisance settlement offer was proof of my absolute surrender, she decided that extracting money was not enough. She needed a social victory. She needed to publicly humiliate me one last time to validate her narrative. Ignorant of the impending detonation, she orchestrated a confrontation that would accelerate her own destruction. The timeline of destruction required a brief detour back to Atlanta before the final drop in Savannah. 3 days prior to the mediation, Vanguard Freight Solutions hosted its annual Maritime Logistics Charity Gala at a prominent Midtown hotel. The event was highly publicized, drawing the elite of Atlanta's corporate sector. Despite my mandatory administrative leave, Richard Vance permitted my attendance under a strict caveat. I was to remain a silent observer, sequestered near the perimeter, avoiding direct interaction with key clients. Richard needed the optical illusion of stability. My physical presence at the gala projected a unified front, countering the whisper network suggesting my imminent termination. I arrived at 8 o'clock, wearing a tailored, minimalist black gown devoid of embellishment. I positioned myself near a towering floral arrangement near the rear bar, nursing a glass of sparkling water. The ballroom buzzed with the low, modulated hum of high-value networking. Helen Dixon's intelligence gathering was primitive, but effective. She likely monitored the social media feeds of Vanguard's public relations department to track my location. Armed with the belief that the $50,000 settlement offer was a flag of total surrender, Helen and Brooke decided that extracting capital in a mediation room was insufficient. They craved a public spectacle. They wanted to corner the defeated executive in her own arena and perform a victory lap. At 9:15, the atmosphere near the entrance shifted. I felt the disturbance before I saw it. The polished, seamless flow of the Atlanta elite parted to accommodate an intrusion of aggressive, uncalibrated energy. Helen and Brooke breached the ballroom. Their appearance was a jarring contrast to the subtle, expensive restraint of the corporate crowd. Helen wore a heavily beaded sapphire gown that screamed of a bygone decade. Brooke had squeezed into a tight, metallic gold dress that reflected the chandeliers with harsh intensity. They looked exactly like what they were, grifters attempting to masquerade as royalty. They scanned the room, their eyes darting past the executives and politicians, searching for the target. Brooke spotted me near the rear bar. She tapped Helen's arm. They began their approach. I did not retreat. I set my glass down on the marble counter. I engaged the cold, analytical framework of a forensic auditor. I observed their gait, the frantic energy in their posture, the sheer desperation radiating from their attempt to project power. Helen led the charge. She bypassed the polite, modulated tones required in such a setting and deployed her primary weapon, volume. Aria. She projected the name across the surrounding tables. Several Vanguard partners and local shipping magnates paused their conversations, turning to observe the disruption. Helen marched into my immediate proximity, planting herself firmly in my personal space. Brooke stood half a step behind her, a smug, brittle smile plastered on her face. "I see you are still pretending everything is fine," Helen announced, ensuring her voice carried to the adjacent group of executives. I looked at the woman who had framed me for $40,000. Her makeup was thick, masking the deep lines of stress around her mouth. The sapphire beads on her gown looked heavy and cheap under the direct light. "Helen," I said quietly. The volume of my voice forced the surrounding audience to lean in slightly to hear the exchange. "You are trespassing at a private corporate event." "Oh, do not try to pull rank on me tonight, Aria." Helen's voice grew louder, feeding on the attention of the onlookers. She gestured broadly. "We received your lawyer's little letter. $50,000. It is a cute opening offer, but we both know you are finally going to pay your debts to this family. You are terrified of what happens if you do not." The executives standing nearby exchanged alarmed glances. This was the exact public relations nightmare Richard Vance had feared. Helen was attempting to legitimize her extortion plot in front of Vanguard's peers. She was using the threat of a scene to force me to cower. She expected me to grab her arm. She expected me to whisper frantic pleas and drag her into a hallway to negotiate. She expected the girl she exiled 8 years ago to surface and surrender. Instead, I picked up my glass of sparkling water. I took a slow, deliberate sip. I looked at Brooke, then shifted my gaze back to Helen. I did not raise my voice. The power of a takedown does not reside in the volume. It resides in the specificity of the data. "Helen," I said, maintaining the quiet conversational tone, "I am not terrified. I am simply observing a master class in financial desperation." Helen's theatrical smile faltered. "Excuse me." I turned my attention to Brooke. The metallic gold dress caught the light. "Brooke, your American Express Platinum card was declined at a grocery store in Savannah 3 days ago. Your primary residential mortgage on the Oak Creek property is currently 120 days in arrears, and the bank initiated foreclosure proceedings last Tuesday." Brooke's mouth fell open. The color drained from her face, leaving her thick foundation looking like a mask. "How do you—" I shifted back to Helen. I did not give them a moment to recover. "And Helen, that sapphire gown is a discontinued line from a regional department store. It was marked down to clearance last month. You likely purchased it on a high-interest store credit card because your primary landscaping business accounts are currently overdrawn by $17,000. The silence in our immediate radius was absolute. The Vanguard executives and local magnates were no longer just observing a disruption. They were watching a surgical dismantling. The pity Helen had sought to extract from the crowd instantly transmuted into profound, icy contempt. The elite of Atlanta do not tolerate aggressive poverty masquerading as power. "You do not belong here," I continued, my voice entirely devoid of inflection. "You are not intimidating. You are transparent. You crashed a charity event because you are drowning in debt and you erroneously believe I am a life raft. You are performing a pantomime of power while your entire financial structure collapses beneath you. Helen's chest heaved. The performance of the righteous, victorious mother shattered, exposing the frantic, cornered animal underneath. She looked at the faces of the executives surrounding us. She saw the disgust in their eyes. The social humiliation she had utilized to exile me in Savannah was now being weaponized against her in Atlanta. She grabbed Brooke's arm. Her fingers dug into the metallic fabric. "You think you are so smart, Arya," Helen hissed, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "You think you can embarrass us. We will see how smart you are tomorrow. We are not taking your $50,000. We are going to take everything at that mediation. We are going to bleed you dry." She expected the threat to land. She expected a flicker of fear. I held her gaze. I did not blink. I took another slow sip of water. "I look forward to it, Helen." The utter lack of resistance paralyzed her. Without an opposing force to push against, her aggression had nowhere to go. She released Brooke's arm, turned sharply, and marched back toward the ballroom entrance. Brooke scrambled to follow, her metallic dress swishing loudly, her head down, avoiding the stares of the crowd. They exited the venue, leaving a vacuum of tension in their wake. A senior partner from the Vanguard acquisitions team stepped closer to me, raising an eyebrow. "Arya," he murmured, "was that your family?" "Not anymore," I replied. The gala incident was the final accelerant. Humiliated in Atlanta, Helen and Brooke would return to Savannah, fueled by a toxic combination of rage and profound delusion. They would walk into the mediation room the following morning, blinded by their need for vengeance, entirely convinced they possessed the leverage to destroy me. They did not know that the $50,000 offer was a decoy. They did not know about the Cyprus wire transfer. They did not know that Gray Folder Holdings, LLC, owned their warehouse. The listener feels the electric anticipation. The bait had been swallowed whole. The trap was fully armed. The final confrontation was no longer a negotiation. It was a scheduled demolition. The conference room in the Savannah Arbitration Center possessed the sterile, unforgiving aesthetic of an operating theater. Fluorescent panels buzzed faintly overhead. The walls were painted a flat, institutional beige. In the center sat a massive, polished oak table. It was a space designed for the clinical dissection of conflict, devoid of any warmth or distraction. I arrived precisely at 9 o'clock. David walked beside me, his stride measured and commanding, projecting the absolute authority of a high-tier corporate litigator. I carried the heavy leather briefcase in my right hand. We entered the room. The opposition was already seated. Helen, Thomas, and Brooke occupied the far side of the oak table. They flanked their legal counsel, a man named Sterling, whose cheap, ill-fitting suit and slicked-back hair radiated the distinct desperation of a strip mall attorney. The atmosphere on their side of the table was nauseatingly triumphant. Helen wore a crisp, severe blouse, her posture rigid with perceived victory. Thomas stared at the table, his hands folded, playing the role of the reluctant patriarch forced to discipline his errant child. Brooke sat next to her mother, occasionally whispering and casting smug, superior glances in my direction. They looked like a family preparing to collect lottery winnings. At the head of the table sat Judge Harrison. He was in his late 60s with sharp, assessing eyes and an expression that suggested a profound intolerance for time wasting. "Please be seated," the judge instructed. His voice was gravelly and authoritative. "We are here to mediate a resolution regarding the contested initial capital partnership agreement and the pending notice of intent to sue." David and I took our seats opposite the family. I placed the leather briefcase flat on the table in front of me. The brass locks caught the harsh fluorescent light. Judge Harrison nodded toward Sterling. "Counsel, you may present your client's position." Sterling stood up. He buttoned his suit jacket, puffing his chest slightly, assuming the posture of a formidable litigator. He cleared his throat and launched into a long, rambling, highly emotional diatribe. Your Honor, he began, gesturing dramatically toward my parents. My clients, Thomas and Helen Dixon, are hard-working, salt-of-the-earth citizens of this community. 8 years ago, they made a profound sacrifice. They provided their daughter, Aria, with $40,000 of their own hard-earned corporate capital as a seed investment to launch her career in Atlanta. In return, they drafted a legally binding partnership agreement, securing a modest 15% equity stake in her future endeavors. Sterling paused, looking at me with manufactured disdain. Now Aria sits atop a logistics empire worth millions, refusing to honor the very contract that made her success possible. We received the defendant's insultingly low $50,000 settlement offer. Frankly, my clients were deeply offended. However, given their generous nature and a desire to avoid publicly embarrassing their daughter in a courtroom, we are willing to accept the $50,000 today, contingent upon Aria co-signing a commercial loan for her sister's business. He sat down, crossing his arms, looking incredibly satisfied with his performance. Helen nodded in agreement, dabbing the corner of her eye with a tissue, slipping effortlessly into the martyr persona she had perfected 8 years ago. Judge Harrison turned his sharp gaze to David. Does the defense have a response to this demand? David did not stand. He leaned back in his leather chair. My client will respond directly, Your Honor. The room shifted its focus to me. Helen's smug expression tightened. Brooke leaned forward, eager to watch me surrender. Thomas kept his eyes glued to the oak grain. I did not speak immediately. I engaged the weaponized silence. I looked at Sterling. Then I looked at Brooke. Then I locked eyes with Helen. I let the silence stretch. 5 seconds. 10 seconds. 15 seconds. The absence of sound became a physical weight in the sterile room. Sterling shifted uncomfortably. Helen's posture grew rigid. The momentum of their arrogant victory lap stalled completely against the absolute stillness of my reaction. I reached forward and snapped the brass clasps on the briefcase. The sharp dual clicks echoed loudly in the quiet room. I lifted the lid. I bypassed the forged partnership agreement. I reached for the first transparent binder, the one containing the authenticated bank records obtained by the private investigator. I pulled the binder out and slid it smoothly across the polished oak table directly toward Sterling. I pulled out a second identical binder and handed it to Judge Harrison. Let us address the foundational premise of this entire extortion attempt, I stated. My voice was calm, pitched at a conversational level that demanded absolute silence to hear. Mr. Sterling, you claim your clients invested $40,000 into my career. You claim they possess a contract to prove it. But before we discuss forged documents, we need to examine where that money actually went. Sterling frowned, opening the binder. He flipped past the title page. Turn to page 4, I instructed. I looked directly at my mother. The smugness was beginning to fracture, replaced by a nascent, creeping panic. She recognized the layout of the landscaping company's internal ledgers. 8 years ago, I continued, $40,000 vanished from the Dixon Landscaping Supply Emergency Fund. For nearly a decade, the narrative maintained by Helen and Thomas Dixon was that I embezzled those funds. I shifted my gaze to Brooke. When that narrative proved insufficient to cover the deficit, they allowed the assumption to circulate that the money was utilized to fund your luxury wedding, Brooke. They let you believe I took it. They let the town believe I took it. Brooke frowned, looking confused. She glanced at Helen, whose face was rapidly draining of color. But forensic accounting is a rigorous discipline, I said. I directed the room's attention back to the binder. Page 4 is a certified bank record, obtained through federal bankruptcy discovery, detailing a wire transfer authorized by Thomas Dixon exactly 3 weeks before Brooke's wedding. Sterling's eyes widened as he read the document. He traced the routing numbers with his index finger. The $40,000 did not go to Atlanta, I stated, my voice echoing off the beige walls. It did not go to wedding vendors. The money was wired to an offshore holding company registered in Cyprus. It was deposited into a fraudulent shell account operated by a sophisticated real estate scam. The silence in the room shattered. The impact of the revelation hit the table like a physical detonation. Thomas and Helen Dixon lost the entire emergency reserve to an email scam, I continued, ruthlessly hammering the final nails into the coffin of their public image. Terrified of admitting their staggering financial incompetence to Brooke's wealthy new-in-laws, they needed a distraction. They needed a scapegoat. So they deliberately framed their 24-year-old daughter. They destroyed my reputation in Savannah, exiled me from the family, and lied to their entire community, simply to cover up the fact that they were absolute fools. Brooke snatched the binder from in front of Sterling. She stared at the certified wire transfer. She saw her father's signature. She saw the Cyprus routing destination. The realization hit her with devastating clarity. She looked up, her face pale, her eyes wide with shock. She turned to her mother. "Mom," Brooke's voice trembled. "Is this true? Did you wire that money?" Helen's mouth opened and closed. She looked like a fish pulled onto a dock. She reached for the binder, her hands shaking violently. "Aria, you cannot just manufacture these lies. It is a certified federal bank record, Helen," David interjected, his voice slicing through her panic. "It is irrefutable. You lost the money in a scam and framed your own daughter to hide it." The toxic family dynamic collapsed instantly. The alliance forged by greed and entitlement evaporated. Brooke stood up, her chair scraping harshly against the floor. "You let me hate her," Brooke screamed, her voice shrill and hysterical, pointing a shaking finger at Helen. "You let me think she ruined my wedding. You let Tyler's parents think my sister was a criminal. And you did it because you were stupid enough to fall for an internet scam." "Brooke, please, lower your voice." Thomas finally spoke, raising his hands in a weak, pathetic attempt to pacify the eruption. "Shut up," Brooke shrieked, turning on her father. "You are both pathetic. You bankrupted yourselves and you tried to drag me down with you." While the family imploded in a spectacular display of internal betrayal, Sterling was undergoing a profound professional crisis. The strip mall lawyer stared at the Cyprus wire transfer. He looked at the forged partnership agreement sitting in his own file. He realized, with terrifying clarity, the legal jeopardy his clients had placed him in. He had submitted a formal notice of intent to sue based on a document his clients had clearly forged to extort a corporate executive. He had emailed that forged document to a corporate board of directors. He was standing on the precipice of disbarment and federal extortion charges. "Your Honor," Sterling stammered, his face flushed, looking at Judge Harrison, "I was entirely unaware of these financial records. My clients assured me the partnership agreement was legitimate." Judge Harrison looked over his reading glasses, his expression radiating pure judicial contempt. "Counsel, it appears your clients have utilized your services to facilitate a fraudulent extortion attempt." The room was in absolute chaos. Helen was weeping, trying to grab Brooke's arm. Brooke was screaming insults at her parents. Sterling was frantically shoving papers into his briefcase, attempting to distance himself from the radioactive fallout. They were broken. The 8-year-old lie was dead. The extortion plot was dismantled. They had been exposed as frauds, fools, and criminals in front of a retired judge. Any normal person would assume the execution was complete. But the listener knows I did not drive 3 hours to Savannah merely to clear my name. I did not spend my corporate suspension digging through bankruptcy files just to prove a point. Exposing the scam was just the psychological dismantling. The physical demolition was still inside the briefcase. The ultimate dramatic irony was about to be unleashed, and the family, currently screaming at each other across the oak table, had absolutely no idea they were standing in a building they were about to lose. The acoustics of the conference room amplified the screaming. Brooke stood over the table, her hands flat on the polished oak, yelling variations of the same accusation at my parents. Thomas remained frozen, his gaze locked on the Cyprus wire transfer, as if hoping the document would spontaneously combust. Helen, cornered and publicly stripped of her martyr persona, reacted the only way a narcissist knows how when the facade collapses. She attacked. She slammed her palms against the table, matching Brooke's volume. Enough. Helen shrieked, silencing her daughter. The veins in her neck strained against the collar of her severe blouse. She turned her venom entirely on me. Her face was flushed, her eyes wild with the frantic, irrational anger of a cornered animal. "You think you are so brilliant, Arya," Helen yelled, spittle flying from her lips. "You think bringing these papers changes anything. We raised you. We fed you. We put clothes on your back. You owe us for every breath you take. You sit up there in your glass tower acting superior, but you are nothing without the foundation we gave you." She pointed a shaking finger toward the center of the table. "We do not care about the wire transfer. We are not dropping the lawsuit. If you do not give us the $50,000 today, we will take this all the way to trial. We will drag your name through the mud until your pristine corporate board fires you permanently. We will bleed you dry in legal fees. You will pay us one way or another." Sterling, the strip mall lawyer, looked horrified. "Mrs. Dixon," he hissed, grabbing her forearm, "stop talking immediately. You are admitting to extortion on the record." Helen ripped her arm away from him. "I do not care. She is going to pay." The outburst hung in the air, vibrating with toxic entitlement. Helen believed that sheer volume and the threat of mutually assured destruction could still force a concession. She believed that because I had remained silent during her tirade, I was calculating the cost of a trial and preparing to surrender. I looked at David. He offered a nearly imperceptible nod. I reached back into the open leather briefcase. "Helen," I said, my voice cutting through the lingering echoes of her screaming. The tone was cold, sharp, and entirely devoid of the emotional static she desperately wanted to provoke. "You are not going to trial. You are going to pack." I pulled out the final transparent binder. I did not slide it to Sterling. I slid it directly across the table to my father. Thomas looked up from the wire transfer, his eyes hollow. He stared at the new binder sitting in front of him. "Open it, Thomas," I commanded. He hesitated, his hands trembling slightly, before lifting the cover. "Let us discuss the concept of foundational leverage," I stated, addressing the room but keeping my eyes locked on my father. For the past 4 years, Dixon Landscaping Supply has leased its primary operational warehouse and the surrounding industrial yard at 402 Industrial Parkway. Thomas nodded slowly, confused by the sudden pivot in topic. "You pay your commercial rent to a subsidiary management trust," I continued. "You mail a check to a post office box in Atlanta. You have never met the property owner. You simply assumed you were dealing with a faceless, bureaucratic holding corporation." Brooke stopped pacing. She looked at the binder, then at me, her brow furrowed. Helen crossed her arms, defensive and wary. "Look at the primary document in that binder. Thomas," I said. "Read the name of the LLC that holds the commercial deed to the property your business occupies." Thomas looked down at the heavy, watermarked paper. He traced the bold black letters printed across the top of the deed. "Gray Folder Holdings, LLC," he read aloud, his voice barely a whisper. I watched the exact moment the realization penetrated the fog of their arrogance. I watched the gears align. Gray Folder Holdings. "That is my company, Thomas," I said. The words dropped onto the table like anvils. "I am your landlord." The silence that followed was absolute. It was not the weaponized silence I had used earlier. It was the sudden, suffocating silence of a vacuum. All the oxygen in the room seemed to vanish. "For the past 4 years," I continued, my voice steady, relentless, "every commercial rent check you mailed to Atlanta was deposited directly into my corporate portfolio. You have been subsidizing the very empire you falsely claimed to have seeded. You built your landscaping business on land that I own. You operate out of a building that belongs to me." Thomas stared at the deed. His jaw slackened. The remaining color drained from his face, leaving him looking like a corpse. "But the irony does not stop there," I added, leaning forward slightly, resting my forearms on the table. "Because of the massive capital you drained to subsidize Tyler's failing construction business, Dixon Landscaping Supply has exhausted its operating reserves. You are currently 90 days past due on your commercial lease." I pointed to the second document in the binder, the tenant ledger displaying the glaring red delinquency banner. "Under the strict terms of your commercial lease agreement, a tenant 90 days in arrears is in material breach of contract," I stated. "Furthermore, initiating a fraudulent, bad faith lawsuit against the property owner violates the ethical conduct clauses embedded within that same contract. You sued your own landlord while 3 months behind on rent." Helen's arms dropped to her sides. She stared at me, her eyes wide, the magnitude of the trap finally becoming clear. The extortion plot, the forged documents, the screaming demands. They were standing in a house entirely made of glass, and they had spent the morning throwing stones at the owner. I reached into the briefcase one last time. I pulled out a single sheet of heavy, bonded paper. I did not put it in a binder. I placed it flat on the oak table and slid it precisely to the center. "That is a formal 30-day notice of eviction," I announced. "Gray Folder Holdings, LLC is terminating your commercial lease effective immediately for non-payment of rent and breach of contract. You have 30 days to liquidate your inventory, remove your commercial vehicles from my property, and vacate the premises entirely." Brooke let out a short, hysterical gasp. "You cannot do that. You cannot just take their business." "I am not taking their business, Brooke," I replied, my gaze cold. "I am taking my building. Their business is already dead. I am just calling the coroner." I turned my attention back to Helen and Thomas. The absolute demolition was nearly complete, but I needed to secure the final parameters. I needed to ensure they could never threaten me, my career, or my peace again. "Here is the choice you face today," I said, addressing my parents. "Option 1, you sign the voluntary dismissal of your forged lawsuit right now in front of Judge Harrison. You accept the eviction notice. You vacate the Savannah warehouse in 30 days, and you never attempt to contact me, my board of directors, or any entity associated with Vanguard Freight Solutions ever again." I paused, letting the weight of the demands settle over them. "Option 2, David interjected, stepping into the role of the executioner. "If you refuse to sign the dismissal, or if you attempt to fight the eviction, I will take the authenticated Cypress wire transfer and the forged partnership agreement directly to the Fulton County District Attorney. We will file federal charges for wire fraud, extortion, and forgery. You will lose the warehouse, you will face criminal prosecution, and you will likely serve time in a federal penitentiary." I looked at Helen. She was trembling. The theatrical martyr, the aggressive grifter, the arrogant mother who believed she could control the narrative through sheer volume had been reduced to nothing. She had no leverage. She had no capital. She had no defense. She was trapped in a room with the daughter she had exiled, realizing that the daughter had evolved into an apex predator. "Sign the dismissal, Helen," I said quietly. "Sign it, take your eviction notice, and go back to Savannah." The climax had peaked. The jaw-dropping payoff was executed flawlessly. The forged lawsuit was dismantled, the scam exposed, and the family's physical business location reclaimed. The listener, who had waited patiently through the lobbied insults and the corporate suspension, is finally rewarded with the ultimate, devastating checkmate. The architects of my ruin were handed the exact tools required to dismantle their own lives. Sterling did not attempt a rebuttal. He stared at the Cypress wire transfer, then shifted his gaze to the eviction notice resting in the center of the oak table. The arithmetic in his eyes changed from profit to sheer self-preservation. A lawyer operating on the fringes of ethical conduct recognizes the precise moment a bluff turns into a federal liability. He reached forward, gathered his legal pads, and shoved them into his battered leather satchel. The zipper rasped loudly in the sterile room. Mr. Sterling, Helen stammered, turning toward him as he stood up. Where are you going? You are our counsel. You have to fix this. Sterling did not look at her. He looked at Judge Harrison. Your Honor, I am formally withdrawing my representation of the plaintiffs in this matter, effective immediately. I was not privy to the financial disclosures presented here today. He turned and walked toward the exit. He did not look back. The heavy door clicked shut behind him, sealing my parents inside the room without a shield. The departure of their proxy broke the final tether holding Thomas Dixon together. My father reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a silver pen. His shoulders slumped, the posture of a man who had spent a decade carrying the weight of a lie and finally buckled under the load. He did not read the voluntary dismissal form. He simply pulled it toward him, signed his name on the bottom line, and pushed the paper across the wood toward David. Thomas, no! Helen shrieked, grabbing his arm. You cannot just give up the warehouse. It is our entire livelihood. We do not have a livelihood, Helen. Thomas spoke in a hollow, raspy whisper. We have a debt, and we are done. He stood up, buttoned his coat, and walked over to stand by the door, leaving his wife isolated at the table. Brooke had already pushed her chair back, creating physical distance from the mother she now understood to be the architect of their collective ruin. Helen looked around the room. She saw her husband standing by the door, defeated. She saw her golden child glaring at her with unveiled disgust. She looked at the eviction notice, bearing her name. The reality of the devastation bypassed her denial and struck bone. The funds were gone. The physical business location was gone. The social standing she prized above oxygen was about to evaporate the moment the town realized why the landscaping company shuttered its doors. Her legs gave out. She did not sit down in her chair. She slipped off the edge of the seat and dropped to her knees on the institutional carpet. The theatrical tears she had utilized at the church, in my corporate lobby, and at the charity gala were gone. These tears were raw, ugly, and born of profound terror. She scrambled forward on her knees, reaching out across the short distance until her hands grasped the hem of my tailored trousers. Arya, please, Helen sobbed, her voice cracking, stripping away every ounce of the refined Southern matriarch she pretended to be. I am sorry. I am so sorry for all of it. Please do not take the building. We will have nowhere to go. We are your parents. We are family. You cannot do this to your own family. I looked down at the woman weeping on the floor. I felt the fabric of my trousers pull tight against her grip. 8 years ago, a younger version of myself might have felt a fracture of pity. A younger version of myself might have reached down, lifted her up, and negotiated a compromise to stop the crying. But I am a forensic auditor. I understand the difference between remorse and consequence. Helen was not crying because she regretted framing her 24-year-old daughter. She was crying because the invoice for that decision had finally arrived on her desk, and she lacked the funds to cover the balance. I reached down and firmly detached her fingers from my clothing. I took a deliberate step backward, creating an unbridgeable physical perimeter between us. I reached for the lapels of my blazer and secured the center button. Family does not forge invoices, Helen. I picked up the leather briefcase. I nodded to Judge Harrison, thanking him for his time. David collected the signed dismissal forms and tucked them into his portfolio. We turned our backs on the wreckage. I walked out of the conference room, leaving my mother weeping on the floor, my father staring at the wall, and my sister calculating the exact cost of her own ignorance. I did not look back when the heavy door closed. The air in the hallway felt lighter, stripped of the toxic static that had tethered me to Savannah for a decade. The narrative jumps forward 3 weeks. The corporate environment of Vanguard Freight Solutions operates on a rigid timeline, adjusting swiftly to new data. Armed with the sealed mediation transcripts, the signed lawsuit dismissal, and the private investigator's authenticated report, David and I bypassed the standard human resources channels and scheduled a direct meeting with Richard Vance. We laid the documentation on the CEO's mahogany desk. Richard read the files in silence. He reviewed the Cyprus wire transfer and the subsequent extortion plot. When he finished, he removed his glasses and offered a rare, calculated apology. He acknowledged that the suspension had been a reactionary error based on a highly sophisticated fraud. He pushed a reinstatement contract across the desk, welcoming me back to my corner office. I did not sign the contract immediately. I utilized the leverage the situation afforded me. The firm had publicly doubted my integrity, and restoring that trust required a premium. I renegotiated the terms of my return. I did not just walk back into my old role. I left Richard's office an hour later with a promotion to Executive Vice President of Acquisitions, a substantial equity increase, and an unassailable mandate over my division. The crisis designed to strip me of my career had instead fortified my command. The fallout in Savannah followed a predictable, terminal trajectory. The 30-day eviction notice expired. Greyfolder Holdings, LLC secured a court order, and the local sheriff padlocked the chain-link gates of 402 Industrial Parkway. The Dixon Landscaping Supply inventory was liquidated at a commercial auction to cover the outstanding vendor debts. The loss of the business severed the fragile bonds holding the family together. Tyler abandoned the sinking ship, filing for a bitter, contested divorce, leaving Brooke to navigate the wreckage of her foreclosed estate alone. Stripped of their income and their country club status, Thomas and Helen downsized to a small rented duplex on the outskirts of the city. Brooke blamed them for her ruined marriage. They blamed her for their financial hemorrhage. The ecosystem of shared delusion fractured permanently. They stopped returning each other's calls. The silence they had weaponized against me was now the only language they shared. I do not check their social media profiles anymore. I do not need to. The gray accordion folder sits in the bottom drawer of my fireproof cabinet, locked and untouched. It served its purpose. The archive is closed. It is a Sunday evening in late October. The air in my midtown apartment smells of roasted garlic and fresh basil. The floor-to-ceiling windows frame the sprawling, illuminated grid of the Atlanta skyline. I am sitting at the head of a long, polished dining table. David is seated to my right, pouring a robust red wine into crystal glasses. Sarah, a trusted colleague from my acquisitions team, is laughing at a story David is telling about a chaotic deposition. 3 other close friends fill out the table. The conversation is loud, warm, and entirely genuine. There are no performances here. There are no hidden agendas or emotional ransoms. This is the perimeter I built. These are the people who earned their seats at the table. They do not require an invoice to validate their presence. I raise my glass, the crystal catching the ambient light of the room. I take a sip, letting the rich flavor settle, and look out over the city I conquered. Some debts are real, and some debts are manufactured to keep you compliant. The people who demand the most from you are often the ones who owe you the heaviest apologies. They will use guilt as a currency, hoping you are too exhausted to audit the ledger. If your family sent an invoice for their love, what would your receipts say? You do not have to pay them. Just keep your receipts. Tell me your story in the comments. We often view the traditional family as a sanctuary, a place where the doors lock from the inside to keep the cold out. But what happens when the cold is sitting at the head of your own dining room table? In the story of Aria Dixon, we watched a brilliant logistics executive dismantle the parents who framed her. We cheered for the gray accordion folder. We felt the profound satisfaction of the eviction notice sliding across the oak table in Savannah. Yet, beneath the tactical precision of that retaliation lies a quiet, lingering tragedy about the fundamental duties of parenthood. The Dixon family did not fracture because of a forged partnership agreement or a commercial lease delinquency. They collapsed because decades earlier, Thomas and Helen forgot what it actually meant to raise a child. Parenting is an exercise in emotional architecture. The foundation you pour determines the exact weight the structure can hold over a lifetime. Helen and Thomas built their home on the shifting sands of public perception. In modern American culture, there is a profound, silent pressure to project an immaculate life. The manicured lawn, the successful spouse, the flawless children graduating with honors. Social media acts as an amplifier for this pressure, turning domestic life into a competitive sport where vulnerability is viewed as a deduction in points. For parents like Helen and Thomas, the facade became more valuable than the people living behind it. They viewed their landscaping business and their social standing not as tools to provide for their daughters, but as monuments to their own egos. To maintain this monument, they divided their children into two distinct ledgers. Brooke was the asset. Aria was the liability. We see this dynamic play out in subtle, insidious ways in households across the country. We shield one child from consequence to protect our own comfort, while demanding flawless performance from the other to validate our worth. By treating Brooke as the golden child, Helen and Thomas robbed her of the opportunity to develop resilience. They paid her debts. They curated her image. They insulated her from the friction of reality. When the friction finally arrived in the form of a bankrupt husband and a foreclosed estate, Brooke shattered. She had no tools to navigate failure because her parents never allowed her to practice failing. They handed her a script of unearned entitlement, and she read it until the audience walked out. Raising children requires the courage to be publicly imperfect. It demands the emotional awareness to look at your child and say, "I made a mistake, and I am sorry." When Thomas and Helen lost their emergency reserve to an offshore scam, the ethical response, the parental response, was to swallow their pride, admit their foolishness, and face the social fallout. True family responsibility requires the adults in the room to absorb the impact of their own errors. Instead, they outsourced their shame to their youngest daughter. They prioritized their reputation at the Savannah Country Club over the emotional safety of their own flesh and blood. This is the rot that destroys traditional family structures from the inside out. When image replaces honesty, love becomes conditional. It becomes a transaction. Aria received a brutal curriculum. She learned that her value was tied entirely to her utility and her silence. She learned to build a fortress because the people who were supposed to shelter her handed her over to the wolves. Children are the ultimate auditors of our character. They watch us. They catalog our reactions to stress, our definitions of fairness, and our relationship with the truth. If you raise a child in an environment where apologies are viewed as weakness and accountability is treated as an insult, you are not raising a family. You are training adversaries. The American ideal of the traditional family is rooted in mutual respect, hard work, and moral fortitude. It is about guiding a child toward independence while providing a tether of unconditional support. Helen and Thomas severed that tether to save face. The result was a sterile conference room in Savannah where their daughters looked at them not with reverence, but with undisguised contempt. The legacy of their parenting was not a thriving business or a cohesive family unit. It was a padlocked warehouse and a series of blocked phone numbers. Look at the contrast between the Dixon household and the dining table Aria built in Atlanta. Aria sits with David and her trusted colleagues, sharing roasted garlic and genuine laughter. That table represents the true outcome of honest living. Family is not defined by shared genetics or a common last name. Family is a daily practice of fairness, transparency, and emotional availability. Aria became a forensic auditor of truth because she grew up starved for it. She built a chosen family based on transparent contracts and mutual respect, replacing the toxic, unwritten obligations of her youth. The true measure of a parent is not found in pristine holiday photographs or the cost of a wedding registry. It is found in the quiet moments decades later. It is found in whether your adult children choose to drive 3 hours to sit at your Sunday dinner table, or whether they use that time to draft a cease and desist letter. We all write the story of our families, line by line, day by day. If the themes of Aria's journey resonated with you, if you recognize the hollow ache of being the one held responsible for debts you did not incur, you are in the right place. We share the stories that bring the shadows into the light. Take a moment to subscribe and follow Revenge Order. Join our community of listeners who understand the value of keeping the receipts. Think about the ledger sitting on your own kitchen counter. We all inherit accounts from the people who raised us. Some are filled with warmth, equity, and quiet grace. Others are running at a severe deficit, balanced on the edges of pride and unspoken resentment. You cannot change the currency your parents used when you were young. You cannot undo the labels they assigned to you before you were old enough to speak for yourself. But you alone decide what to do with the balance today. You decide whether to keep funding a ghost town or whether it is time to close the account and build your own fortress. Look closely at the people sitting across from you at your next family gathering. Are they sharing a meal, or are they just waiting to hand you an invoice?